everybody to the Central States Numismatic Society Education Forum. We have with us today Mr. William Cowburn from Pennsylvania, who's going to tell us all about why we should collect error coins to put fun back into the hobby. I'm interested in that. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Rick.
Good.
Well, thank you for coming this afternoon. About coins, so this is just a wonderful afternoon for me. As many of you may know, I tend to focus more on earlier U.S. coinage. I really like the coinage from our 19th century, but I also am fascinated with errors, how they happened, how they came about. We really learn a lot about the manufacturing process when you get involved with error coins. But probably one of the more appropriate things for my theme here today is to put fun back into the hobby. I think today we tend to get bogged down a great deal with whether a coin in our collection is going to come back graded as an MS67 and it only comes back in MS66 and we're just heartbroken and it's just terrible that the graders don't know what they're doing, and we have all this angst and horror with what's supposed to be an enjoyable, pleasurable hobby to take us away from the troubles of the world and our business and anything else. We get lost, I think, a little bit with our regular hobby of collecting. And perhaps if you look at collecting error coins, you can get away from some of those pressures that you might be feeling otherwise. Errors are a lot of fun. There's, as I said, an awful lot to learn about the minting process with collecting errors, but it also gives you a whole new outlet. We brought in an awful lot of brand new collectors over the last 10 years with the state quarter program. And that's a fantastic program. It's wonderful for the hobby, but collecting the quarters from all 50 states, while it's a lot of fun, and that's what the hobby's about, it's not necessarily that difficult to do. And once you get the 50 state quarters, you may be asking yourself, what's next? Where can I go from here? Because we don't want to just stop with having the 50 state quarters. Some people will go back into the earlier Washington quarter series because they've grown to like what the Washington quarter is all about, and that's wonderful. Some people may expand into other areas of collecting because they got started with the state quarters. But there are other areas you can go into, and I'm going to show you some of that today. An awful lot. You see on the opening graphic that I have, a lot of these are state quarter errors. As Ray well knows, I put an exhibit in here at Central States a couple years ago on state quarter errors. And that was fun to do. It really was. It showed a lot of the different types of errors that happen and explained how they happen. So it's a lot of enjoyment that you can get out of it, and I hope you'll learn a little bit today about the manufacturing process and how these things happen. Okay, our technical problems have been resolved, so we're back to our talk here on collecting error coins. And the first one that I'm showing you, and by the way, I do have examples of a lot of the, well, I shouldn't say a lot. I have several examples up here that when I'm finished talking, please come up, take a look. Some of them are a little better understood in hand as opposed to just a photograph up here. And the first one sort of falls into that category. This is a 1961 Lincoln cent, but it is struck in silver. And that happened because the dime blank is almost the same size as a cent blank, but it's a tiny bit smaller. So it is possible that a dime blank got stuck in one of the bins that the blanks and planchets were part of before they got dumped into the machine. A blank dime could have been stuck in there before, was never struck, and went through when the press was set up to strike Lincoln cents. So this is a Lincoln cent that is actually struck in 90% silver. The coin is here, and it looks an awful lot more like silver than it does in this photo. So please take a look at that when you're done. Now, something like that, you can find something that looks similar, and you may think that it's silver, but there are ways to tell without being destructive. One of the first things you want to do is check the weight. If it was struck on a silver dime planchet, it should weigh the same amount as a silver dime. Somebody could very easily coat this with a material to make it look like it's silver, but then it would weigh the same as a regular Lincoln cent, which is a totally different weight. So there are ways you can check this to be sure. And one of the other things, because the dime planchet is slightly smaller in diameter than a cent, you can see that the lettering didn't quite go the whole way out here, and that's because there just wasn't enough metal out there to fill in with the strike. So there are some ways to check on that. This is the reverse of that same coin. What I'm doing, by the way, I did have some handouts. Anybody who didn't get them, see me afterwards. I'll be sure you get one. I'm sort of going in a procession through what we call the PDS system in error collecting. PDS, very familiar to us collectors of US coins at least, as the mints for Philadelphia, Denver, San Francisco. But for error collecting, PDS takes on a different character. And in this case, the P is for planchet, the D is for dies, and the S is for strike. It's just a way of categorizing the error type. And what I'm showing you, what I was showing you with the Lincoln cent, was an example of a planchet problem. And that was a wrong planchet that got struck by Lincoln cent dies. It was a planchet intended to be for the dime. So there are wrong planchet types of errors, and that was an example of one. This next error type falls into the D category, or the die, and this is what they call a cud. And a cud is really just a die break, and you'll see die cracks on state quarters all the time. They're very common. The dies are striking these coins under extremely high pressure. So that die steel is taking a real beating, and they're cranking out large numbers of coins from those dies. So it's under a lot of stress, and the die steel will eventually crack. And you may find a die crack running on a state quarter, maybe from the nose down, someplace that's a weak point in the design, and on a lot of state quarters it's very common to see. A cud, though, we had the die crack that came across here, and under the stress of constantly striking coins, the crack grew worse and worse until eventually a piece, this section of the die, actually broke away and fell off. So when the next coin was struck, there was nothing here for the die. There was nothing left here to strike the coin. All the rest of the die was in place and worked just fine. But we had this void where nothing from that one die, and keep in mind there's three dies involved in the striking of a coin. We've got the obverse, the reverse, and the collar. The collar restrains the planchet from expanding too far, and that is a third die. But there was nothing here to strike, so we've got this big void. The interesting part, or one of the interesting parts with that, is then on the reverse, you have this reverse die was intact. The reverse die is fine. Everything is there for the detail, but this is the area where on the obverse die, the piece broke away, and it's very, very weak and indistinct on the reverse because there was no pressure being put down in this area from the obverse die. So there was nothing there to bring up the design on the reverse of the coin. So that's what they call a cut. A cut is a die break that went from rim to rim, at some point rim to rim, and the piece or section of the die fell away. And the cuds are very nice. You can get these in pocket change because these things will pass through coin counting machines without any problem. So this is an error type you can actually find. I'm not going to say you're going to find it with regularity because they don't, the Mint's pretty good. Their quality control process is pretty good. They don't get a large percentage of errors out into circulation. And of course, that's their goal. Believe it or not, it's a governmental agency, but they do take pride in what they do. So they really don't want to see the errors getting out there into circulation.
Bill,
Yes.
is that your coin?
Yes, it is.
All right, okay.
I don't have that example with me though, but yes, that is my coin. These are all my coins.
Okay.
These photos were all mine. So we went from a planchet error to a die error, and this is a striking error. This is a coin that got struck twice by the dies. It was struck this big area here, it was struck normally. The planchet thing, I should have brought two dies with me. I have some of the dies that the Mint sold with the state quarters, and you can at least visually see this a little better. But we have the two dies, what they call the hammer die that's pounding down, and an anvil die that's sitting fairly solid. Those two dies come together with a planchet in between, ideally, the way it's supposed to work. After that coin is struck by the dies, the coin is ejected and another planchet comes in to get struck. Well, what happened here, this coin didn't eject entirely from the dies, it got hung up and the dies came down and struck the same coin a second time. And there was another planchet. A second planchet was feeding in right underneath here. So out there somewhere, there's a mate to this that has an indent from this area here where the die struck this coin, but underneath it is blank on the mated coin. Now the reverse of this, you see this area here, that's where the new planchet had fed in. And so the die, the reverse die, wasn't able to impart its design here. You get to see it on the front, on the obverse, but you don't here because of the way the planchet fed in. But this is a coin that was double struck, and that one is up here that you can take a look at afterwards. And like I said, state quarters, just a lot of fun for me. There's a lot of ways you can go with state quarters. If you wanted to do an error collection, you could look for specific types of errors, like these incomplete planchets. You could look for, or off centers, or anything along the line, anything that you really like. You could look for different state quarters with those types of errors. Some people just want an error example from each state, and they're not necessarily, they don't really care so much what type of error it is. They just want to have an error from each state. Any number of ways you can go. Your collection's your own. You can put it together how you see fit. But people, the common term, and I will say this, but I try not to. The common term for this is a clip. A clip, though, implies that this piece, this blank section here, was clipped away from the planchet. And that's really not how it happened. I do have some webbing that may illustrate the point better, which you can, again, take a look at. But when you see this webbing, our coinage, when it's being started, the metal is rolled out into very, very long sheets, proper thickness for whatever coinage it's going to be. In this case, we're rolling out long sheets to strike quarters, so we've got the quarter metal, and it's going to be rolled down to the right thickness, and it's fairly wide. And what they have to do then is cut out or punch out blanks from this metal that will be a round disc to be struck into coins eventually. And that process really looks like a cookie cutter. You just have this machine that's coming down across the long sheet of metal, punching out circles, punching out blanks to be used for coinage. Now sometimes though, as the metal is moving along and the cookie cutter is punching these out, it doesn't feed properly. And if it doesn't feed properly, the cookie cutter process can end up overlapping. And when it overlaps is where you get this sort of circular shape that is an incomplete planchet. So clip is the very common term, but it leads us to thinking that it really isn't how the error happened. So this blank, before this is struck as a Connecticut quarter, this blank went through that process. The punching gave us an incomplete planchet. Then planchets are fed through an upsetting mill that gives the blank an upset rim the whole way around. And it hardens the planchet a bit, but it enhances the striking ability for the coin. And when that goes through the upsetting mill, what you end up with this big void over here, the upsetting mill is a machine that forces the planchets through a channel that gets slightly narrower as the planchet goes through to force up the sides of the rim. And as it's doing that, each side of the upsetting mill are applying pressure on that planchet. Well, if you think of it in that term, when it's going through the upsetting mill, over here, the upsetting mill has nothing to push against. The way the diameter of this coin is, there's nothing for the upsetting mill to push against on this side. So directly opposite from it, you can see this area that is fairly indistinct. And that area has a name, it's called the Blakesley effect. And that's named after a gentleman who first noticed it, wrote about it, described it. And this Blakesley effect is there on most, I won't say all, of the ones that have incomplete planchets, but on something this big, the Blakesley effect is fairly clear. And that's just this indistinct area. So this is the reverse of the same coin, and you can see how much different it is over here, where both sides of the upsetting mill were able to apply pressure compared to this. So it has a completely different look. And people talk about, oh my gosh, I don't want to collect something like this because it could be so easily faked. Someone could take a regular coin and just cut away this piece. Well, there are diagnostics that you can look for. This is one of them, but another is the metal flow in this area. If this is cut away after the coin is struck, there's a completely different look to the coin. When this was struck with this area missing, the letters sort of flow down into this void because it wasn't there when the die struck it. If that was cut away afterwards, it's a completely different look to the coin. So, you know, with anything else, counterfeits can be a problem, but with knowledge, you can avoid the real problems that are out there. And we're back to a different cud. This is a very famous one, if you will, within the state quarter series. This is a well-known cud for the Kentucky quarter. And it's just as I described before. We've got a die break that went from one point on the rim to another, and then that section of the die broke away. And that, like I said, that's not a difficult one to find. Same thing with Colorado. We've got this. I got that out of a roll of Colorado quarters. So as I said, you can find some of these in pocket change. Now, don't expect to find off-centers and things that are misshapen. They're just not going to pass through the counting equipment to allow that to get out into circulation. I know you said don't drink that, Ray, but I had to.
Yeah. Keep an eye on it.
Okay, now here's one. We'll go to the next slide. This is just the obverse, but here's the reverse of it. This is an off-center for a Georgia quarter. And the rule of thumb, because I'll show you a broad strike here a little bit later, maybe the next slide, I don't recall. But differentiating between an off-center and a broad strike. They look very much the same. But to be an off-center, you must be missing part of the detail. And down here, it's not a lot, but the E and P and pluribus, the bottoms of those are missing. What happens is the obverse and reverse dies are going to come down together. As I said, there's a third die, the collar. The collar centers the planchet for striking. It also imparts whatever may be on the edge. For a quarter, the reading. A nickel, it's a plain edge, but the collar imparts that design onto the edge. So it serves a very valuable purpose. It also keeps the metal from flowing freely in all directions. It keeps it nice and tight to the right diameter. Sometimes that collar will stick in the down position. The collar has give. You know, we are talking a modern manufacturing process that you want to have the material, your presses, be a little bit forgiving. So that collar has some give, and the collar will ride up and down on some springs. But what can happen? It can get stuck out of position. And if it's stuck out of position, if the collar isn't there in the right position when the blank comes in, the hammer and anvil dies are going to strike the planchet, but the planchet may not be centered properly because the collar wasn't there to restrain it or keep it in its proper place. And that's what happened here. The collar wasn't in its position, so this wasn't centered when it got in between the dies, and you've got this big unstruck area that is called an off-center because it's missing part of its design. Now, I think the broadstruck is the next one. Yeah, this looks off-center. When you look at this, it looks off-center because there's all this area that didn't get struck. But when you look out along the edge, gosh, the design really is all there. It's not missing anything. And we go to the reverse, or I'm sorry, go to the obverse, everything's there. So it's very, very close to being off-struck, but technically this would be a broad strike. I'm sorry?
An uncentered broad strike.
An uncentered broad strike. Yes, I do have a photo of a centered broad strike later on. The collar was out of position here. It is not centered. And this coin will have no reading because the collar wasn't there to impart any reading to it. And I do have a photo to just sort of let you see what that looks like if you're looking at the edges. Here's a centered broad strike, and I do have this coin along. Again, probably much better to see it here. I did not take it out of its holder, and the photo isn't the greatest. But this is a centered broad strike, and I really like it because the dime, this has really spread out wide. It's much, much larger in diameter than a normal dime should be. I just like it because of how big it really is. And that's what happens when there's no collar there to restrain that outward flow of metal. The coin will really spread. That's the reverse of it. And I have a better shot of that. This, I wanted to show, we have an off-center or a broad-struck coin up here and down here, and in between I just stuck a regular quarter so you could see the reading and how the edges of the broad strike look compared to a regular one. This over here, by the way, that's just some reflection. That's really not reading on this coin. That's reflection coming down from this. But that's the way a broad struck or off-center should look with the edge. It didn't have the collar there, so that edge should be plain. And as Ray said, I am from Pennsylvania, so I had to throw a Pennsylvania quarter in here. This is a slightly different type of incomplete planchet. It happens pretty much the same way, but it's a little different because this is a straight edge as opposed to that curve that we have on the other. This happens when the cookie cutter gets to the very end of the roll of coinage strip. And it's cut this planchet out, but gosh, the strip ended, and the planchet ended up being used anyway. Again, you can see there's this Blakely effect directly across from it, this weakness or indistinct area directly across from the missing part of the planchet. That's just looking at the other side of the coin. Not just state quarters, not just something new. This has been going on for a while. Morgan dollars. Morgan dollars, if you get a nice big incomplete planchet, you probably have something special. Morgan dollars, though, with the rim clip, this real little area, are fairly common. They're easy to get, they're inexpensive, just nice additions to your collection if you like Morgan dollars. But you don't tend to see these large silver coins having big incomplete planchets like I was showing you some of there with the state quarters. I think I have some. That's the other side of this Morgan dollar. And there's a peace dollar with the same thing with a rim clip. And here's a night dollar. And I've found these to be a lot of fun. The incomplete planchet, I found some that are fairly large, incomplete planchets with Ike dollars. But what I've done over the years was build up a collection of the circulation strikes of Ike dollars with incomplete planchets. So I have a 71, a 71D, a 72, a 72D. I'm ignoring the silver ones, I'm ignoring the proof-only issues, that type of thing, because you're not really going to find these types of errors on those types of issues. But I decided years ago to try to put together a set with all the circulation dates in the Ike dollars with incomplete planchets. Some dates, fairly easy to get. You see them pop up a lot. Some others, pretty difficult. So there's a bit of a challenge if you want to go into something like that. But it's a nice way to add errors to your collection. Just the reverse of that. Okay, now, what I told you earlier, broad strike versus off-center. Off-center, some of the design element is missing. Broad strike, all the design element is there. They can be centered or uncentered. This is obviously uncentered. Looks like we've got some design missing down here. So just looking at what you're seeing here, this looks like it should be an off-center. Anybody disagreeing with that? Yes, I didn't get that far yet. But at a glance, that's what this looks like. We've got an off-center coin. This is a slight variation, and one that I really like. If you look at this side, this was not struck off-center. This was perfectly centered with that obverse die. But the dies were not aligned properly. I have MAD down here. That stands for misaligned die. And what you want to think of visually are anvil die and our hammer die. And I'm showing you in this vertical configuration because that's easier for my eyes, but I think most of the presses today are going horizontally. It's sort of the same thing though. These dies should be lined up perfectly, one above the other. What happened here, the hammer die was slightly off-center from the anvil die. And it makes a really neat looking piece. And this side of it, once again, because this part of the planchet wasn't sitting on the other die, or wasn't being struck by the other die, there was no pressure being applied. So this area is very indistinct. That's fairly wide, what I'm showing you with this misaligned die. You can find very small, very minor misaligned dies fairly common, I'd say. This one's getting a little further out there as far as how far out of alignment they were. But that's part of what makes this a lot of fun. I have in your handout something that I do want to mention. I've mentioned this before when I've talked about errors, but I recall as a Boy Scout back in the 1960s, I received a publication called Boy's Life. And I still remember reading an article somewhere in the mid-60s in that magazine where they talked about error coins, but they weren't called error coins. The article was talking about Fidos. And for the life of me, when I read that as like a 12-year-old boy, I could not understand why anybody in their right mind would want to collect something that was obviously a mistake and that, according to this article, was a dog, because they're calling this thing a Fido. Well, the Fido was an acronym. It stood for freaks, irregulars, defectives, and oddities. And that's where the hobby was at that point in time when it came to errors. These things were freaks and defectives. And the hobby had a totally different view of what an error coin was at that point in time. We've learned an awful lot since then. We've learned a lot more about the minting process since then. In fact, back at that time, the mint was extremely secretive. They didn't want to share their minting process with collectors. So it was a lot harder for the typical collector to get a good handle on how coinage was being made. And those kind of terms came out. They stuck around for quite a while. And of course, my mind changed a lot later on when I realized that these have a wow factor that you know, your average circulation coin doesn't necessarily have. Let's face it, you know, I'm not picking on collectors of modern coinage, not picking on collectors of state quarters or anything else. These all have great parts in our hobby. But if you took an Ohio $quarter and had it slabbed by a major grading company and it came back as an MS-70, financially you'd be thrilled because this coin is suddenly worth a lot of money. But if you showed that slabbed MS-70 Ohio $quarter to your best friend who doesn't collect, they'd look at it and say, oh, it's an Ohio quarter. I've got some of those in my pocket right now. What's special about this? You know, they can't make that connection. But if you show them an Ohio $quarter that is 50% off center, or has a 30 or 40% incomplete planchet, or an Ohio quarter dollar that was struck on the wrong type of planchet material, right away they know something's different, something is cool, something is really interesting about this coin, and their eyes will light up even though they're not a collector. They know there's something neat about this. So errors add a whole nother dimension to your collecting, and one that I think we all can appreciate and learn a lot more from. So that's what I hope you get out of it. I do have some examples up here. I do recommend very highly, by the way, anybody who's interested in this area of numismatics, these two books. This one is published, it was written by Fred Weinberg and Arnie Margolis. This, I think, is the 3rd edition, maybe the 4th edition is out now, the Error Coin Encyclopedia. And this coin was written by Alan Herbert, who is also known as the Answer Man and is on the ANA Board of Governors. It says Price Guide to Mint Errors. This really isn't a price guide. This thing is fantastic as far as telling you how errors are made. This is just full of great information. The only thing, someday I've got to talk to Alan and ask him, the title of this is Price Guide to Mint Errors, yet he makes a great argument within here that we should not call these errors, we should call all of them minting varieties. Makes a fantastic argument for that, yet there it is, bold as day on his own book that calls them errors. So I got to talk to him sometime why he did that. But I guess errors is more marketable than minting varieties. But in any case, they're up here too for anybody who would like to take a look. So that's what I have today. Any questions?
Bill, isn't Fred Weinberg here at our show?
Fred Weinberg is here at our show, and Fred always has great error material. And while he has very high-powered, expensive material, he also always has a lot of relatively inexpensive, interesting, neat error coins. So, you know, don't be intimidated just because he's a real big name in the hobby. He's also one of the friendliest, one of the most helpful. He will explain anything to you about this part of the hobby. Fred's a wonderful guy. He really is. I don't know, is Arnie set up here? I don't think he is. And there may be some other error dealers here. I don't want to slight anybody with what I'm saying with that, but Fred is great. He is a co-author of this one book, and like I said, he's very knowledgeable and very willing to share that knowledge with us. So,
Bill, he's also usually a judge for the
Yes.
error exhibit.
yes, yes, he is.
Yeah.
Yes,
I got a question on the clips.
yes.
How do you tell when the clip was made from the planchet to the striking? You know, are there clips there after they get struck? You know.
Clips that after they were struck,
Yeah.
that would be anything that happens after the coin is struck.
I mean before. I mean, you have the planchet. That is good. Then it goes to
Okay.
the stamping process, and somehow that gets
That wouldn't happen unless you have a slightly more exotic type of error where it does sometimes occur where we've got this sheet of metal that the blanks are going to be punched out of, and occasionally the cutter will only go partially through. So you've got this gouge, this cut that maybe, let's say, was 90% through the metal. And occasionally that will get struck. That gouge you can see on a struck coin if it doesn't fall apart. Occasionally, very rarely, that piece can break away. But again, you can see some differences in the way the lettering looks. You're going to have to study that one, though, a lot more carefully to be able to distinguish what happened with it.